Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin, the co-founder of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Join us as we learn from experts on how to build a successful and ethical business. So today I was delighted to be joined by Amanda Campbell. Amanda does a number of things, or has done a number of things throughout her career, broadly covering marketing, advertising, corporate affairs, and sustainability. She now works as a consultant working with senior executives within her clients' organizations to develop sustainability reporting strategies and ultimately communication strategies. So very, very well, experienced individual and a really, really great guest to have had on the show. We had a fascinating conversation around a number of things, but really the focus was on the impact of CSR strategies and sustainability strategies on employee well-being and the vice versa impact, i.e. how strong and positive employee well-being can help further our CSR and sustainability initiatives. So really interesting conversation in light of that, something that certainly from the Anti-Greenwash Charter's perspective, as we look to build out our team and set the sort of groundwork for what we're going to do to create a positive working environment. Some really interesting lessons to have gleaned from the conversation. So just want to say a big thank you to Amanda for joining us today. And as always, to you guys for listening into the show. If you do have any questions or comments for either Amanda or ourselves, please do get in touch. Thank you. Amanda, thank you so much for agreeing to give us some of your time on this Thursday morning and join us on the Responsible Edge. It is fantastic to have snaffled you and got you on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
No, thank you for joining us. So, Amanda, I know you're aware we've obviously had our little preamble before today's show sort of started, but always really keen to just sort of begin with introducing you to our listeners and getting a bit more of an understanding of your background. Maybe, go back as early as you like, but, what's inspired you? What's led you down the path that you've gone down in terms of your professional career? Any particular highlights? Just give us a bit more on you.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how far I'll go back, but I'll just go back to my career. So I tend to divide my career so far into sort of its quarters currently. It used to be thirds. So the first quarter I spent working in marketing and advertising agencies, primarily in the West Midlands. And then I studied for my master's degree in marketing part-time. And in 1998, I was one of the first chartered marketers, which was a big achievement. And then I hopped the fence to become client side, moving firstly into automotive, and then from automotive into fashion, which is a really strange move. But gives you an incredible view of retail, absolutely. And then the third quarter saw me move into real estate and start to specialise in communications, eventually becoming corporate affairs director at Into PLC. And it was at Into I also got asked to take over the sustainability team. So that's where I became the corporate affairs and sustainability director. And I was reflecting when I was thinking about today, and when I look back at those 25 something years, there's been this thread of sustainability running throughout, even though I didn't realize it at the time. So right from the beginning, we were looking at how do we recycle dirty tires more effectively? How do we break them down and recycle them? To, in the fashion side of things, how do we make our packaging more sustainable? How do we air freight less stuff? Through to managing philanthropic relationships with people like Save the Children, to leading our mental health plan at Into, and then eventually, creating and delivering a full corporate sustainability strategy. So I
Amanda,
think
I'm so sorry to interrupt you there, but I'm fascinated by this. Thinking back to, I could go in and ask that whole question around going from agency side to client side, but that's done. I think I'll sort of focus in on the particular point around sort of without it being described as, the sustainability agenda of the company, while you were marketing and advertising within the automotive space and fashion space, you were working on those things. Was it from the perspective of, as a marketer or an advertiser, doing these things is going to give us a real competitive edge and a great story to be able to tell? or was it sort of, was it from a perspective of integrating true sustainability into the way that we do things is the right thing to do and part of a bigger, broader kind of corporate strategy? How did it play out in terms of the input behind it?
I think certainly with the tyres, so with the automotive piece and the fast fashion piece, sustainability wasn't mainstream then. So the tyres was, I mean, that was legislatively driven. So we had to, as the as the people changing the tyres, we had to get rid of them. And so how do you do that in a way that's cost effective? But also that adds value. So that was the first time, I think, even though I didn't know the phrase circularity, that idea of how do you take something and then break it all down for it to be something else again. So we did some really exciting projects. We were looking at how do we strip out the metal components of a wheel, for example, of a tire, and how could you reuse those? And if you stripped off the dirty rubber, which is the outside of the rubber, what could you do with the dirty rubber? And then what could you do with the clean rubber? And might that be melted down? Could it be crumbed? And, that's where you start to see things like, rubber-based mouse mats and that kind of thing. So that was legislatively and economically driven. And it was the same within the fashion. There were new packaging regs coming in. There was a waste packaging regulations. Because I was responsible for packaging, it sat in my area, and therefore it was. So how do we meet these packaging regulations? We need to reduce the amount of packaging that we're doing. So it was driven by outside factors. But as I got involved in understanding those things, I got really excited about the fact that we were using less resources, understanding what things were made of. And that was then where there was an opportunity to start looking at, well, how is that therefore an advantage in terms of our marketing communications? But back then, it just wasn't really being spoken about. So it was definitely legislative and economically driven.
Fascinating. Okay. And then running forward, you then find yourself head of corporate affairs. And sorry, that wasn't within the fashion company you were working with. Was that a new role?
So I left the fashion, I left pure retail and moved into real estate. So firstly worked for the Australian company Lend-Lease.
Yeah.
So probably there I worked on Blue Water Shopping Centre. I worked on the Athletes Village at the Olympic Park. I worked on Elephant Castle redevelopment, and I worked on Greenwich Peninsula. So some big meaty developments. But within the real estate sector, and Lend-Lease particularly, were incredibly sustainability focused. So it was one of our pillars. And you learn very quickly that you needed to do stuff in a more sustainable way. So I think that for me was where my training really started.
And then you're at Lend-Lease, and then you moved on from there, and that's when you.
Yes.
Sorry, I can't remember the company's name that you joined. It was IO?
E2.
E2. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I then became Director of Corporate Affairs and then Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability.
Okay, brilliant. And then I'm sorry, I stopped you in full flow before because you were beginning to talk about how, yes, there was this commonality or this sort of observation that, yes, sustainability played a part essentially in the work that you've done throughout the whole of your career. When you then took on, the official, if you like, role of sustainability kind of director, if you like, what impact did that have on the way that you then approached that particular type of work?
So it was really interesting. So I'd already had the approach, that everything we do should be, to quote they say, legal, decent and honest. And, everything was always started with, well, tell me the truth and we'll go from there, and we'll retain the truth all the way through it. So that's always been how I've done my job. And I'd become more and more interested in sustainability. And I think I was kind of looking at other projects when I was Director of Corporate Affairs as to how could we use it, because the corporate affairs role is so all encompassing and it covers so many aspects, and I was responsible for sustainability reporting. But the big difference for me was entering this world of acronyms and technical language and vagueness and difficulty getting people to do stuff. So first of all, it was a really steep learning curve, but I had an amazing team who very patiently took me through what an SDG was, a sustainable development goal, took me through all the acronyms, explained all the different reporting frameworks. And I think part of my curiosity and learning enabled them to be looking at things differently. But I think, so it was a really tough learning curve, but I think inherent interest and my personally, we were very sustainable as a family. There was then, I realized there was this real opportunity to affect and influence change on a much bigger basis across the whole organization, using my corporate affairs, communications and marketing skills and what I'd learned as a leader over the previous 20 odd years.
And out of interest, Amanda, was that, I might be massively oversimplifying this, so feel free to dissect this, but was that because you observed learning about sustainability that, wow, there's this whole new world that I'm having to learn that perhaps has these complexities and the vagueness, as you've alluded to, and just a lack of clarity? And then you saw your experience within comms and marketing and the sharing of messaging as being a way that you could kind of reposition sustainability within the company so that it was something more easily digestible for people. Was that part of it?
It was definitely a really big part of it. I think one of the reasons I've been asked to look at it was I just run a really major strategic change management program. So which had to change lots of behaviors, and it was a really big program. And the challenge we had at the time was that sustainability sat in a little corner and they didn't have that much influence, and when they asked for things it didn't happen. And I sat in my first committee meeting and was astounded that people hadn't turned up with the reports they were expected to turn up with. So I think it was the combination of how do you take this very complex but incredibly important topic and make it relevant and personal to everybody who works for us in order to effect the change that we needed. And we needed to do it quickly because we were behind our peers on various reporting requirements. So, we were completely legal. But for example, things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, another sustainability acronym, our peers were well on the road. We hadn't started. We hadn't yet started our net zero strategy and pathway. So we got a lot to do in a very short period of time. And there's no way that the incredibly small but talented sustainability team could do it. We needed to open up the doors and to get experts within the organisation to understand and take responsibility for driving bits forward that were in their area. So we had an energy manager, well, surely he should be involved. We had a development director, well, he needed to be involved. We had a director of asset management, she needed to be involved. So it was about that. How do you use communications to simplify it? How do you use my experience of driving change? And then from a leadership point of view, how do you encourage, influence, motivate a very disparate group of people to start thinking about sustainability as part of their job when they already were busy with lots of other stuff?
And how and I love that you crescendoed on that, because my next question is, so in very simple question, perhaps a more complex answer that 45-minute podcast we don't have to go into in too much depth, but how did you do that? How did you get people on side?
So we went back to real basics. So the first thing was around data and evidence. So, I did the very obvious thing. Where are we now and where is it that we need to be and what's that gap? And then as a sustainability team, so what is it we need to do to get there and who do we need? So we kind of charted out what does it look like. We then did a materiality assessment, which is where you go out to everybody who's important to the organisation, all of your stakeholders, and ask them about sustainability in relation to your organisation. So we did that piece of work, and we did it with a lot of the internals. So then once we then pulled together an overarching strategy, as a member of the executive team, I was then able to present it to the executive team, but did it in a way which was presenting challenges or provocations, which I knew that I would get discussion and they were presented in such a way that you would get the answer back you wanted to get back, but people would have a really good discussion around it. So that through that process, people started to go on a journey, then got them to agree their ambition. So have you got a low ambition, a medium ambition? Do you just want to hit the rules? Do you just want to be legal, or do you want to be market leading in each of the various areas? And so they chose, or as the executive team choose, where do we think we need to be legal and compliant, and where do we think we have the skills, ability and excitement to be leading edge? So they set that agenda. And then when we'd done all of that, it was then, well, here's the list of the 10 things we need to do. Where do you think you need to, what's the bit that you need to take up? So initially enabling them to say, well, clearly that bit's mine. And so it was very much this kind of, and it took place over a couple of workshops, as well as some one-to-one conversations, lobbying, you might call it. But what we got to the end was that the exec team signed off a plan and a strategy that they had helped create and felt ownership for, and had put their hands up to say which bit they were going to deliver.
It's fascinating. Go on.
Yeah. No, carry on.
No, I was just going to say, I love how, you concluded with exactly the point I was thinking about as you were running through there, which is like, how do you get people to adopt this? Well, you get them to help to contribute directly towards the development of that strategy and to buy into the vision. Like, guys, do we agree that this vision that we set is a compelling one, is one that will help us achieve some of our commercial goals, etc. as an organization? If we buy into that, let's then work back to how we go about delivering it. It's almost, you've got them sort of you've got them on board at that point. It's then just about delivery. So sorry, I was just, I guess, summarizing in my own mind that was a brilliant way to approach it.
Thank you. And I think, what the phrase that came to mind when you were talking then was, it wasn't done to them. And I think quite often, whether it's a normal change management program or whether it's sustainability in any of its forms, quite often change is done to people. And we didn't do that. So when we then cascaded it, we encouraged the exec leaders to do something similar, or we facilitated that with their teams. So I can remember one particular piece we had got as the sustainability team. We'd got a thought as to what the development team needed to do. And unbeknown to us, they'd been having conversations with a completely different external supplier and were further along the path than we knew. And whilst our paths weren't exactly aligned, what we were able to do was say, well, continue working with the company that you're working with, and come back and say, how can you integrate what the corporate objective is with your department objective, and what are the challenges. And that was brilliant, because then suddenly they felt even more ownership, because we hadn't said, no, you can't work with that supplier, you must do this. We give them the opportunity and the challenge to take the work they were doing and to bring it aligned with the corporate vision.
I love that. There's such a confidence from your perspective in not, suggesting, no, this is the path that we're leading. If you're working with an external supplier that essentially isn't perfectly aligned with that, then you need to stop working with them. The fact that you were confident enough, I guess, in your position and in the process that you're taking the organization through, I think is fantastic. That collaboration is brilliant. Let me ask you, man. I've done the classic thing of being totally sucked into all things you, and I feel like we could do like we'll just have a bio episode at some point.
Let's not. That'd be really boring.
No, I'm loving it. We definitely do that. I just want one final thing in terms of you and your background. Just talk us through kind of the work that you're doing now. Like, what's your area of focus and the stuff that you're up to?
So what I realized was I was loving what I was doing, and that combination of the communications and the sustainability, and I really loved that. But during the pandemic, I realized that I didn't want to commute into London on a daily basis. So I live in Warwickshire, and I'd done it for 16 years, but I just having that break, during the pandemic, I just thought I don't want to do that anymore. And I'd had some visions for sometimes setting up my own business. So as with so many people did, that's what I did. And so today I'm really fortunate, actually, Charlie. So I just do what I love. I help companies to develop their sustainability strategy and to tell their story in a meaningful and truthful way. But then I also work with sustainability leaders as a coach to help them to lead and drive change, because I've been there and I know how difficult and tough and lonely it can be. And so I think I'm really fortunate, and I love what I'm doing right now.
That's so cool. And Amanda, I think what I love about, especially that last point about coaching and working alongside sustainability leaders, is that you can see in the experience that you've had previously that again, there's nuance to the things that you do or that you did to ensure that the sustainability strategy was adopted as successful as it was. So I imagine that the coaches, the clients that you're working with on that coaching basis are absolutely, full of value in terms of working with you, which is great to hear. Let's move on, though. We obviously, as we do on the Responsible Edge, shared with you an article. I can't remember. It was in Corporate Wellbeing magazine, I think, perhaps.
Yes, yeah.
Something like that. Not one I'd come across before. I guess from our perspective, we're always looking to kind of share an article with the experts that we get on that obviously relates a little bit to the work that they do, but equally is of interest to us as the founders of the Anti-Greenwash Charter and the business that we're building with that. So I think from our point of view, we're obviously a startup at this stage, and we're looking to think about how we develop and build our team. And so that's why I think, CSR and the influence that has on employee well-being and the integration between the two was of particular interest. But perhaps you could just start by giving our listeners like a bit of a flavor and overview of, what the article covered, and crucially, what were the kind of key, lessons or points for further reflection that you pulled out of that particular article?
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting. So it came from the idea of, how can they called it CSR strategy, a corporate social responsibility strategy or sustainability strategy. How can that be part of the toolkit for corporate wellness programs? And I guess with wellness programs, it's kind of what we'll refer to primarily as well-being. So I kind of think the two are, I might be wrong because I'm not a wellness expert, but it sort of felt that the two are sort of, you can swap them out. Yeah, exactly. And they defined, so the first thing they did was they talked about what wellness was or what well-being was. And they talked about it as being linked to a number of pillars. So things like, health, being active, your social interactions, learning, volunteering, the environment within which you're operating. And then they defined CSR in terms of, that sort of three pillars of environmental, social, and governance. And what they were trying to, the premise of the article was that if an organization is focusing on the environment, for example, so if you are, removing toxins from the workplace, or if you are adding planting into an office environment, or you've got, better space, if you're thinking from a social point of view in terms of your employee benefits and making sure that you've got really great workers' rights and people aren't working too long hours and their benefits are paid really well and their support systems in place, that has an impact, a positive impact on the wellness of your employees. So that was kind of the premise of the article.
Fantastic. I always like asking our guests to summarize things because 9 times out of 10 they do a much better job than the summary that I have in my head. So that was brilliant, Amanda. Out of interest, reflecting on, I suppose, some of the work that you've done both in your consultancy and some of your previous roles. Was this a consideration in terms of the impact that, the sustainability strategies that you were developing, like their influence on employee well-being?
I think it's really interesting because when I first read it, it was one of those articles when you read it, it just made perfect sense. And when I did reflect on it, I just thought, well, it's intuitive. Of course it is, that there has to be that interrelatedness. And, you know, when you look at most corporate sustainability plans, strategies, employee well-being, there's always a people pillar or a people and communities pillar. And well-being, wellness of some description always is in there. So, and for us at Into, part of our strategy, our chief exec was passionate about mental health and about removing the stigma around poor mental health. And so one of his first briefs to me was, you need to come up with a mental health strategy, which over time, through working with our employees, became a well-being strategy. So yes, well-being was on its own part of our sustainability strategy. But what I liked about this article was it went away from just thinking about having a well-being bit in your strategy and thinking about that interrelatedness. And was there a mutuality between having a really good sustainability strategy being delivered and the impact on employee well-being? And I'm going to stop in a minute because you can ask me a question, but I found some other really interesting research about that in particular when I was kind of thinking about the article.
And that piece of research was that, I think, was it the Forbes piece that you shared with us that looked at? Am I right in getting that right? It was looking at like how sometimes we, I guess, lose sight of the fact that investment in kind of environmental initiatives and environmental impact, if you like, actually we as human beings are a core recipient, if you like, in terms of the value of that investment, in terms of the experiences that we have, and therefore the impact upon our own well-being and wellness. Am I right in alluding to that piece?
So there were two pieces of research. The Forbes piece was lovely, and I think you've explained it really well. And there was a line in it that I loved, which was, "We can't be well on a sick planet." And I love that, and I'm going to steal it because I think it's so good.
Plagiarism is the ultimate form of flattery. We'll just say that. Yeah.
And that kind of just made me stop and think. You know, just such a simple way. So even, and you know, one of the things I always do when I'm talking about sustainability is if people don't get it, or it's not important to them, because let's be honest, there's so many things that need our attention, our money, our time, our effort, our emotions, that it's not important for everybody because there's other things that are more challenging. And I think this is a really lovely way of, you know, of again positioning the importance of having a more sustainable workplace or more sustainable you know, personal life in terms of what it might mean to you. You know, and you think about it, you know, what would you rather look at? Would you rather be in an environment that's all cement and blocks and concrete and man-made materials? Or do you feel better when you can see some sky and some planting? And we know the benefits of green blue, as it's called, upon you know, human well-being. So there was that Forbes piece, which I loved. And then there was another piece of research, which was, it's a bit old now, and it was 2020. And they did acknowledge there were gaps in the research and they needed to do more, but I've not been able to find if there's been done anything more. But they were looking at, is there a correlation between sustainability and well-being? And they did a big literature review, and what they came up with was, yes, they felt there was a strong correlation between having sustainable development and how people reported their own feelings of well-being. So there was that benefit on, you know, if things are more sustainable, then, you know, people feel better and their well-being's better. But then they also discovered, which they didn't expect, was there was a marginal improvement on the outcomes of the sustainability if people felt, you know, had high levels of well-being. It wasn't as big as the other way around, but there was a positive impact upon it.
That's super. Yeah, that is fascinating. If I can regurgitate back to you that, if we can engage with our employees in a way that improves their well-being, then ultimately an improved well-being will help them influence the sustainability agenda of the company positively too.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it's literally I mean, we all talk about circularity now, but essentially we need to think about employee well-being and our sustainability initiatives and programs as being a circular function
Definitely. And I
influencing
think
well.
we found that at Into. So one of the things that we looked at was lots of happiness here. We were involved in something called the Happiness Index. That was our employee engagement platform.
Yeah.
And it was very much focused on well-being. And what we found was the benefits and the systems and the employee schemes and all the rest of it, they didn't necessarily positively impact well-being. If they weren't there or they weren't right, then of course people were not in a great place.
Mm-hmm.
But putting them in place didn't have a massive impact upon well-being. What did have that impact upon well-being was, the opportunity to learn. It was the environment within which they, that they worked, particularly volunteering or getting involved in sustainability initiatives. So, people who were involved in our volunteering policy, where we gave them 15 days a year to go and do any kind of volunteering they wanted. We got them to record well-being before and after the year and the difference that made. So we found there was definitely that correlation between having a more sustainable ethos to the organisation and the well-being of our employees. We never measured it the other way. Didn't even occur to us.
That's super interesting. Does your gut from the experiences that you had there suggest that it would have backed up the research in WWF?
I think so, because I think going back beyond Into, when we were at Lend-Lease, we used to do some work with Groundwork, which is an environmental charity. And one of the projects that we looked at was there was some high levels of vandalism in an area of social housing. And so what Groundwork wanted to do was to green the space up, but also to use natural barriers to some of the antisocial behaviour. So, for example, putting in prickly hedges, because that would prevent people using some of the land, for example, for drug taking, because it's really uncomfortable to slide under a prickly holly hedge. So we did stuff like that. So that was really positive and it looked great. But what happened that we hadn't expected was that there then became so we had put in preventative measures to prevent vandalism, but because it looked better and people felt better about their environment, people then took more care of it. And you started to see people doing their own interventions in terms of, bird feeders and planting plants and cleaning up their front. So yes, intuitively, it does make perfect sense.
That's super. Yeah, no, I can see that, and that's a really nice practical example, I guess, of that playing out. Out of interest, Amanda, I'm filled with questions now, but when you're working with some of your clients and you're starting to develop their sustainability reporting and think about their strategy, etc. Like, obviously we have the P of the S of SCG that obviously will factor into this, but in terms of these impacts upon employee well-being directly, is this something that has commonly come up as part of an objective of organizations you work with, or is this just a nice to have kind of additional extra that fits into the overall program?
I think I've been really fortunate with all the clients I've worked with so far. It's part of where they are already. Mm-hmm. So, for them, employee engagement is really important. I'm thinking, going across my list, all of them are fair living payers, wages. Can't remember what that one's called now. They all pay above the national living wage. They've got all those hygiene factors in, and they're really interested in people are here for at least 8 hours a day, whether here's virtual or within an environment. How do you get the best out of them, and how do you make sure that while they're here? And look, some of that's driven by the commercial reality. It's expensive and difficult to retain great people. So the better you are as a place to work, the easier it'll be to retain and recruit great people. But some of it, and maybe it's just the people I'm working with because of the nature of what I do, they really want their employees to love what they're doing and enjoy what they're doing. And from my experience at Into, and actually at Lend-Lease as well, we used to talk about, there was this kind of blue thread at Lend-Lease and this orange thread at Into. There were our brand colours running through, people who worked for the organisations. And, Into doesn't exist anymore. It went into administration as part of COVID. But the community and the culture around those people who worked there is still really, really strong. I still meet up with my exec once or twice a year for dinner and look at what's going on. And, people are all over the sort of the real estate industry, and people comment upon the quality of the individuals that were ex-Into people. So there's commercial realities to do this, as well as all, because it's the right thing to do.
I love that. Yeah, that's testament, isn't it? That's testament to the quality of the way that the organization approached its people, that's played out in that way. I'm jumping around a little bit here, so I hope you don't mind in terms of my questions. But one thing I wanted to ask about was when you look at kind of an organization committing a lot of money, energy, resource in terms of improving the environmental kind of initiatives that they have in place. What do you think what's your comment on the impact of things that kind of affect the employee at a local level, i.e., suddenly the organization's invested lots of money in plants throughout the office that make it, a nicer, more comfortable, more oxygenated space to work in, versus the organization at a more macro level is making decisions about circularity of its product, or tightening up things from a supply chain perspective and who we're working with in order to make sure that it's environmentally considerate. Where do you sit in terms of what's most impactful on that employee experience and ultimately their well-being?
I think that's a really interesting question. I thought you were going somewhere else with it.
Well, we can go. Feel free to totally interrupt my question with me if you.
I think for me, this is where the power of communications comes in. So, if I'm a machine operator and you have changed the chemical that I use so that it emits less toxins, and that therefore means that I don't have to wear protective equipment anymore. That has a direct impact upon me. If you choose to change the supply of that material from, I don't know, one country to another country, that has no impact upon me. And I think, and therefore there is a real risk that some of those decisions have no relevance to the employee. And so I think that's where it's really important to be taking your employees upon your whole journey. So tell them everything that you're doing, because not everything that you're doing they will see. And, if you explain what your priority and focus is from a sustainability point of view, and then you regularly give them updates as to what you're doing. So I'm currently writing some internal communications pieces for a client. We're talking about waste. We're talking a lot about waste. And some of it impacts them directly because it's about a change to bins, which is such a hot topic in an office environment. And that impacts them directly. But then the stuff that happens once the waste is collected doesn't impact them at all. But it's really important that they understand it, partly because it's about helping educate them in waste generally, but also so that they understand what the organisation is doing and spending its money and time on. So that's a very long answer to the question, because I was thinking as I was talking. But I think if it's not obvious to the employee, then you need to make sure you're communicating it to them to enable them to be proud of the
Hmm.
organization they're working for, to make them feel that the organization has a purpose as part of its commercial piece. And we know that those two things about being involved and feeling you're working towards a sense of purpose, we know that they have a positive impact upon well-being. So that's where the role of great, simple, transparent, but engaging communications comes in.
Amanda, that's a fantastic sort of response to that. While you were going through that answer, I suppose I was sort of coming to a conclusion in my own mind that I guess the absolute ideal, you mentioned when you were speaking about developing a sustainability strategy previously, and kind of identifying where the opportunities were, in the levers to pull to say, well, look, we can definitely do something impactful in this area. Maybe, it's going to be more tricky for us to do something here, but that might be a longer term objective that we might consider in terms of what we might do. It almost feels to me like at that point, you might almost have a consideration to say, well, look, what are these initiatives that are going to have that direct impact on an employee? And what are the bigger, broader, more macro, inspiring sustainability initiatives that ultimately can enable the employees to feel proud, if not directly affected by that initiative? And I guess what that then does, and again, I know you're the expert here, so I'm hoping that you don't totally disagree with this, is that what it does is, if I've had a bit of an experience of the impact of a new, and I know we keep on using the term sustainability, but environmental initiative, i.e., I'm there working on the machine and I no longer have to wear protective equipment. So actually, day to day, my experience is just better. If I'm understanding of that being an initiative that's been put in place, but I'm also sort of supplemented with that by the bigger, broader, more macro impacts, it creates that connection, if you like, for me as an employee, between what's happening at the local level and what's happening at the macro level. In an absolute ideal world, would that be the mix from your perspective of the types of initiatives that we would be implementing?
I think it has to be. And I think there's another reason why that's really important. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase sustainability anxiety, environmental anxiety. This is I think that academics call it a wicked problem. It's a really difficult problem. And one of the challenges that we know faces us at the moment is that it's such a big problem. People think, what impact can I have? And therefore, I think if you take it out of the work environment, if you show in the work environment, there's little things that we can do, or there's things that we can do that are impactful on a local level, and then show the connection between something completely not connected to you as an individual. And if you can show there is that straight line relationship, then maybe there's an opportunity for people to understand that by back to waste again, by rinsing out my baked bean tin before I put it in the recycling can, that makes an impact and helps on that bigger level of the challenges we're seeing on a macro level. And I think you've got to have it at both levels. And also, you need people to help you deliver it. So if you're not giving them a benefit, if they don't feel better in their own environment, then they're not going to be positive and motivated to help you deliver your sustainability strategy. So you can't just focus on all macro stuff. So I think it has to be that combination of the two, because there are so many other benefits it has in terms of showing people that it's that whole thing about, for the want of a nail, the horse was lost, the battle was lost type thing. You've got to have that combination.
And it comes back to that whole point of our conversation about the circular relationship, if you like, between the implementation of a successful environmental sustainability strategy and employee well-being and the influence that it can have on it.
And I think that thing as well, that if you do something that makes you feel well, we know that from a neuroscience point of view, that it triggers reactions in your brain, which makes you want to do it more. So take that back to sustainability. If we can do things that improve our employees' well-being, then that will trigger something, from a neuroscience point of view, that will make people want to do more of it. and then that will just get us there faster.
And then you build an engaged, inspired, committed workforce that then ends up years after the company's been dissolved, still being connected to those other people and being regarded as fantastic employees. We've rattled through about it. I've got one last question before asking you the final question. You've obviously worked at a big corporate level, and obviously working with clients that are similar. Might be a difficult question to answer, therefore, but if you were advising a startup that perhaps had was at the very first few hires, if you like, similar sort of experience to the one that we're going through with the Anti-Greenwash Charter, what, in light of our conversation today, what would be the kind of key things that you would ask that organization to think about in terms of their sustainability strategy and the impact that would therefore have upon the team that they're building?
I think that's really interesting, because actually probably 50% of my work now is with SMEs. So I work with Aston University on their Green Advantage program as a coach, and that is helping SMEs to start their sustainability journey. So I always start with looking at the business and almost a mini version of that materiality piece. So intuitively, what do you think is important to the business and to its growth? And looking into the business, where is the business negatively impacting society, the environment, and where is it positively impacting society and the environment? And then with the answer to those three questions, that then gives you a framework to then start thinking about, well, okay, so you can then take that to, so from an employee point of view, what does that need to look like? So I think it's those three questions. Intuitively, what's important to your business? What's the negative impact your business is having? And what's the positive impact your business is having? And then let's go from there.
Super helpful. Well, we've got this recorded, so we'll definitely be taking those notes. A first point of agenda for next week's team meeting. Amanda, that was brilliant. As I mentioned to you, we always like to crescendo each episode with, and I think you've already provided some like really great advice from a broad sort of strategic perspective, but equally in terms of just looking at your career and the things that you did in terms of the pivots, etc. I think that in itself is really interesting for any young marketeers or professionals out there that are thinking about what happens when I find myself working in the automotive sector and suddenly pivot to fashion. Like, is that okay? Is that an okay thing to do? And clearly from your experience, it plays out that it is. However, let me stop rambling on about you and about what I think your best bit of advice is. And let me ask you, younger Amanda, going back to the beginning of your career, or a young professional out there, what would be a key bit of advice that you would offer to help them?
I think it's really interesting. And my first thought of this was the bit that you've just said, which was almost say yes to opportunities. But then I wanted to think about the article you'd like me to have a look at. And I think probably the key piece of advice I give to my younger self is slow down and enjoy the ride. And make sure, know what your own priorities are, and balance what you're doing around that. So think about your health, think about your friends, think about your family, be really clear about your vision for now and how you can achieve it in a holistic way, but just slow down. I think that's the piece. And then the second piece, which I learned way too late, I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown, and it's about the importance of play. So lighten up, be silly, laugh, dance, whatever it might be. So I think those two were the things for me, linking back into what we were talking about. So slow down and enjoy the ride, understand what's important to you, and play more.
I love that. We've definitely not had play more as a bit of advice offering. We'll have we'll have to do an ecstatic dancing recording at some point. It will probably be our most viral episode going. But
I hope
Amanda,
not.
Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, I knew we were going to end up rattling through things. I think there's so many other areas that even within our conversation today, we could look to explore further. But overall, thank you so much for providing, such tangible kind of insights and practical strategies that, both ourselves as at the charter and obviously our listeners can adopt. So thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure.